for you, madame.
Hello, I'm Jeanette Bussard, owner of High Society Boutique, a quilting and sewing studio in Bluffton, South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of my video series on how to apply binding by machine to your quilts. This is the quilt I'll be working on today. The first thing we're going to do is walk our binding around the quilt. The objective of this is to make sure that our seams in our binding is not hitting or landing in a corner. We don't want all that bulk of all the seam allowances in the corner of our quilt. Also, because I am doing all of my stitching by machine, I'm going to be working from the back of my quilt. If you intend to hand sew the binding onto the back of your quilt, you will work from the front. You will apply your binding to the front of the quilt and then wrap it around to the back to do your hand stitching. So I'm going to flip this over. And I'm going to put my binding in a spot. I'm just guessing where it needs to go. I want to put it in somewhere around the middle of a long side, and I'm going to give myself a good gap when I sew. So I'm going to put it about there and see what happens. So I'm just going to clip it on so I know where I started. So I'm going to walk it to a corner, walking it to a corner, and wouldn't you know it, right off the bat, I have a seam allowance that's pretty doggone close to our corner. So I don't think I want it quite that close. So I think I'm going to move the binding to the right, maybe 6 inches or so. So I'm going to move this down to about there. So starting over, we walk around. Now that seam allowance is in a safe place. I'm going to do a pretend mitered corner, just folding it like I would when I'm sewing it. And keep walking it around to the next corner. Oh my goodness, and I've got another seam allowance right here. So I need to move it a little more. We'll try about there. And this is a bit of a guessing game, so we'll start over again. Here we are. We've got a pretend mitered corner. Walk it around. There's a seam allowance. It's in a fine, safe place. Another pretend mitered corner. And now that seam allowance is not in the corner, so it's in a safe spot. Keep walking it around. Here's a seam allowance. It's in a safe spot. I'll do a pretend mitered corner again. Keep walking it around. Here's a seam allowance. It's in a good spot. Pretend mitered corner. And wouldn't you know it, my binding is about 4 inches too short. So I don't often make a mistake on my calculation of how much binding I need, but I certainly did this time. So I'm going to go and add another strip to this binding. I'm going to do that in the same method that I did in my part 1 video. So I will do that, and next time you see me, I will be at the sewing machine. The first thing I'd like to do is discuss the setup of my machine. I currently have a 1/4 inch foot attached to my machine. Some people like to use a walking foot, and that is just fine. My quilting on my quilts tends to be a little denser, and it goes clear off the edge, so I don't feel like I have fabric that's shifting as I sew, so I don't feel like I need a walking foot. I just use a regular 1/4 inch foot. But if you plan to use a walking foot, you will need to determine where a 1/4 of an inch is on your foot so you know where to focus your eye as you're stitching so you get an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. There are some people that sew their bindings on with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. What that's going to do is make the binding a little more even from front to back. I've intentionally made mine so that the back of the binding is narrower than the binding on the front. And the reason I do that is because I want to make sure that I'm stitching off the binding, because if it's really close, it's very difficult to stay exactly where you need to be. So if you're going on the binding, off the binding, on the binding, off the binding, it's going to look really haphazard. So I prefer to make sure that I am staying within the interior of the quilt as I do my top stitching. So that's why I've decided to do 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Also, I have tamed the binding by wrapping it around an empty cone spool of thread. I do long arming, so this is a typical cone thread. And I've just used an empty spool of that to wrap my binding around. So that helps me to keep all that organized and clutter-free as I am stitching it onto my quilt. All right, let's get started doing some stitching. I have left myself a nice generous tail. I have about a 10-inch tail, and that will make more sense when we finish the ends in the video for part 3. But you definitely want to leave a generous tail. I have my binding aligned with the edge of my quilt. And I want to keep that aligned the whole way around. And I'm just going to start stitching. You don't want to stitch too close to the corner of your quilt at this point. You want to have space to be able to lay your binding miter tool on the bed of your machine, but in front of your presser foot, so you need space to do that. So the beauty of this tool, one of the beauties of this tool, is that it's got this little notch that helps you to mark a perfect 45-degree angle right into the corner of your quilt. I typically use a friction pen. Whatever pen you use, it really doesn't matter, just so long as the color is contrasting enough and fine enough that you can see the line as you stitch further. So I have my line, and it's going right into the corner of my quilt, and I'm going to continue stitching. Now once I get to that line, I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop with my needle down, and I'm going to pivot the quilt so that I'm stitching right on that line, right off into the corner. And I can cut my thread. So that has given us a nice miter right smack in the corner. So that's going to allow us to have a very accurate mitered corner for our binding. Next, we will spin our quilt around. We will fold this up, fold it back down. So you want this binding, the fold of this binding, to be aligned perfectly with the top edge. And you want the edge of your binding to be aligned with the side of the quilt. Now sometimes when you start stitching, the machine won't feed. That's because the presser foot is not level. Because of the thickness of the quilt, the front of the presser foot is higher, or sitting higher than the back. So I've made this tiny little quilt that I use as a leader ender. So I'm just going to insert this behind my binding that I'm sewing on. And I don't want it too close, actually, because I don't want to stitch it to my quilt. But that levels the presser foot. So once I'm well aligned, I can just keep stitching. And I'm going to stitch all the way down to the other corner. Now I will stop short again of the corner because I need to mark it just like we did the last one. So I need space to put my binding miter tool in the corner. Again, I'm lined up with the bottom, I'm lined up with the side, and I'm going to make that mark right into the corner. And stitch right off into the corner. Now I'm ready to fold my mitered corners like we did on the previous corner. Fold it up, fold it back down. I need to spin this around. And I want to make sure that my fold is aligned perfectly with the top of the quilt. I want this binding aligned with the side of the quilt. I'm going to use my leader ender again. And start stitching. And this time I'm going to go all the way around till I get close to where I began. Now I have finished, I completed, and I've left myself a nice big gap. There's a good probably 12 inches here that I've left. So I'm going to leave myself a good gap and some nice long tails. This concludes part 2 of our video series. In part 3, we will learn how to finish the ends of our binding using our binding miter tool, and it will fit perfectly, and we'll finish sewing the gap that we've left in our binding. I hope you'll subscribe to my channel and like my video series so that it's easy to refer back to them again and again. I think you'll find these tutorials very helpful in the future as you learn to use your binding miter tool. Thank you so much for joining me.